He stared at the clock, 2:47 a.m. It's ticking louder than his heartbeat. The ink on his unpaid bills had started to bleed from a spilled cup of coffee. Outside, a factory whistle moaned through the dark. That was the night Jim Rohn realized something. Motivation had left the room. Only discipline stayed. If you've ever sat awake wondering why motivation disappears when you need it most, press like. It tells the world you're still in the fight. The truth hit him hard. Motivation is a visitor, polite, charming, but temporary. Discipline is a tenant, quiet, stubborn, and pays the rent every day. For years, he'd chased the high of inspiration. Seminars, speeches, bright words that promised fire. But when the crowd went home and the chairs were empty, he felt the silence like a weight on his chest. And that night, he found it, not in a book, not in a mentor's smile, but in the dull ache of responsibility. He remembered the farmer from his hometown, the one who woke before dawn, rain or shine. The man never talked about motivation. He just did the work, every single day. "Discipline," Jim said aloud, testing the sound. It didn't sparkle like motivation. It was heavier, realer. It was the bridge between promise and performance. And that realization changed his life. He decided to run an experiment. For 30 days, no motivational posters, no pep talks, no excuses, just a single question written on paper. What would discipline do? Every morning he read it. Every night he judged his answer. The first week was brutal. Cold showers before sunrise, old shoes crunching through frost. He wanted to quit, but discipline whispered, just one more day. And the next morning, one more became another. Here's the truth he discovered. Motivation is emotion. Discipline is decision, and decisions rewrite destiny. But wait, something else happened. Around day 10, the struggle began to feel different. Not easier, just cleaner. The noise in his mind went quiet. He started trusting himself again. He realized success isn't built in bursts. It's laid brick by brick, in silence. That's when he said it, the line that later became one of his quiet laws. We must all suffer one of two pains, the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. When he spoke it the first time, it wasn't a quote. It was confession. He'd tasted both pains, and that night he chose his suffering, the controllable one, the kind that builds, not breaks. Somewhere in the middle of that month, a strange peace arrived. Not joy, not pride, peace, born of doing what needed doing. He noticed his hands looked steadier, his voice stronger. Even the mirror seemed to nod back. Comment below, "I will build," because the world moves when disciplined hearts declare it. He spoke later about how discipline turns time into a servant, how every sunrise becomes a contract signed in sweat, and how the smallest daily act, a page read, a walk taken, a promise kept, compounds into wealth no dollar can measure. He once said, "Don't wish it were easier, wish you were better." But on that cold morning, years before fame, he meant it. He needed it, and that wish turned into ritual. That ritual became identity. He didn't chase motivation anymore. He manufactured momentum. Motivation had taught him to feel. Discipline taught him to become. And that was the real transformation. Years later, when audiences clapped for his words, he would sometimes smile and think back to that single night. The unpaid bills, the cold coffee, the clock at 2:47 a.m., he'd whisper to himself, "That's where it began." If this story spoke to you, subscribe, share it, and build with us. This isn't just a video. It's a reminder that discipline outlives motivation. And yet this was only the beginning, because the real test came when discipline met temptation, when comfort called and success began to whisper back. That's where the next chapter begins. After 30 days of silence and sweat, Jim thought the test was done. But that's when the real temptation arrived, success itself. Because the moment you start winning, the world whispers, "You've done enough." That's the voice that destroys empires. He had made his first $100 teaching others what he'd learned, and for a moment, it felt glorious. He looked at the bills on his table, now paid, neatly stacked, and thought, maybe I can rest. But rest is a thief in disguise. It steals tomorrow's potential and sells it for today's comfort. He remembered something his mentor, Earl Schoaf, once told him, "Don't confuse movement with progress." That night, those words echoed louder than applause. He had moved, yes, but had he progressed? Jim sat back down at that same wooden desk. He opened his journal and wrote 5 words that became a compass for the rest of his life. Discipline begins where comfort ends. He underlined it twice, because he knew what was coming. the test of consistency after the breakthrough. See, success is not a finish line, it's a treadmill. The faster you run, the stronger your legs must become. Stop for a moment, and it throws you backward. So Jim made a rule. He called it the law of maintenance. Whatever you gain through discipline, you must maintain through discipline, because achievement doesn't respect your feelings. It only respects your habits. But wait, that's when something new happened. Success began to change how people treated him. They started calling him sir, inviting him to speak, offering him comfort in exchange for consistency. He smiled politely, but inside he was terrified because he knew this. When the applause gets louder than your purpose, you've already begun to fall. And one evening backstage before a talk, he looked at his reflection and whispered, "Discipline, don't you leave me now." He walked out to the podium. He could feel the eyes, the expectations, the heat of the lights. He paused, long enough for silence to become sacred. And then he said it. Motivation gets you started. Discipline keeps you going. The crowd erupted. But inside, he was praying that he'd never forget how hard that line was to earn. Comment below, "I will stay consistent," because success belongs to those who do, not those who wish. A few months later, Jim faced his next test. He was offered a lucrative business deal, easy money, fast results. But something in his gut twisted. He recognized the scent of shortcut, and discipline whispered again, "Not this way." He walked away from the deal and from half a year's income. People called him foolish. But he slept like a man who'd kept his word. Sometimes the most disciplined act is saying no, because every yes costs you something unseen: time, peace, focus. And Jim understood that regret is built one careless yes at a time. He would rather lose an opportunity than lose himself. Years later, he'd teach thousands about the value of saying no. But in that quiet decade before fame, he learned it alone, in empty rooms, with only the sound of his pen scratching truth onto paper. One morning, he met a young man who asked, "Mr. Rohn, how do I stay motivated every day?" Jim smiled and said, "You don't. You stay disciplined every day. Motivation is a spark, discipline is the fire." The young man nodded, but years later he'd tell others he finally understood what Jim meant, when his own fire almost went out. That's the thing about discipline. It's contagious. One committed soul lights 100 others. One kept promise makes 10 more believable. That's how movements are born, quietly, consistently. And that became his next revelation. Discipline is not personal, it's generational. What you build with effort, others inherit with gratitude. That's the law he lived by. That's the reason his words still echo decades later. He'd say, "Don't set goals for applause, set them for inheritance, because applause fades, but inheritance compounds." And discipline is the only wealth that multiplies every time it's used. So as the years passed, the man who once stayed awake at 2:47 a.m. now taught millions how to stay awake in purpose. And still, even with success, applause, travel, and fame, he began every morning the same way. He whispered to himself, what would discipline do? Yet, the story isn't done, because the final test was coming. Not poverty, not temptation, but loss, when everything he built was shaken. And the question returned, will discipline hold when life breaks you? The storm didn't come when he was broke. It came when he was successful, when he had something to lose. That's when life truly tests a man, not by taking everything, but by asking, can you stay the same when everything changes? Jim's business faltered, partnerships crumbled, and for the first time in years, he faced the old ghosts again: debt, doubt, and the quiet ache of starting over. He was older now, wiser, but pain has a way of making even the wise forget what they know. He said once, discipline is easy when life is fair. It's tested when life isn't. And that was his test. His routine cracked. His mornings grew heavy. The man who had taught thousands about perseverance now had to preach to himself. But wait, here's what most people never knew. That's when Jim wrote one of his most famous lectures, The Seasons of Life. He didn't write it from comfort, he wrote it from loss, from the winter of his own story. He realized life isn't meant to be constant, it's meant to cycle. Winter teaches gratitude, spring teaches faith, summer teaches protection, autumn teaches responsibility. Discipline, he said, is what keeps the farmer sowing seeds in winter, because he believes spring will come again. That metaphor became his healing. Every morning, even when nothing made sense, he followed his same routine. He read, he wrote, he exercised, he planned. He once said, the walls of your life will collapse only when you stop building. And so he kept building, brick by invisible brick. But the pain lingered, the nights stretched. He asked himself, why continue? And the answer came, not in a voice, but in rhythm. The rhythm of effort, the rhythm of breathing through resistance. Because discipline is not about feeling alive, it's about staying alive long enough to feel again. If you've ever kept going when no one saw, press like. It's your quiet signature in the book of persistence. He once wrote in his journal, "The secret of strength is repetition. Repetition of thought, repetition of action, repetition of belief when belief has left the room." That line became the foundation of his recovery and later his empire. Months passed, the storm subsided. His company didn't fully recover, but he did. He came out leaner, sharper, clearer. He no longer feared losing things because he had kept something stronger, his word to himself. Comment below, "I will not break," because storms are temporary, but the disciplined heart is permanent. Later, when he returned to the stage, people noticed something different in his tone. It was slower, softer, but more powerful. He didn't shout anymore. He didn't need to, because true conviction doesn't raise its voice, it deepens it. He began his first lecture after the storm with a single sentence: "Don't pray for easy days. Pray for discipline equal to your days." Silence filled the room, then applause. Not for entertainment, but for recognition. Everyone in that hall had faced their own storm. And that's when Jim understood his true mission. Not to motivate people for a day, but to equip them for a lifetime. Motivation gives you permission. Discipline gives you permanence. He ended that lecture with the same rhythm he began his journey with. Work hard, work smart, work again. That's the code of every builder, every dreamer, every soul who refuses to quit when no one claps. And years later, when he spoke his final public words, he smiled and said, "Motivation starts the story. Discipline writes the ending." He looked into the crowd, young faces, hungry hearts, and knew his message would outlive him, because discipline never dies. It multiplies. If this story touched you, subscribe, share it, and live it. Let the next generation inherit your consistency. Let your habits be the legacy that speaks when you're gone. You will not always feel inspired. You will not always feel strong. But if you choose discipline today, you'll find out you are stronger than motivation ever promised you'd be.